The day of the will reading felt like a performance, one final act in a long, cruel play my father seemed to orchestrate even after death. My two sisters sat across from me, perfectly poised in their black designer dresses, faces painted with the kind of grief that photographs well but feels hollow up close. They already looked like winners before the lawyer even spoke. And then, as if scripted, he did. To my daughters, Claire and Victoria, he began, his voice smooth and detached, I leave the entirety of my liquid estate, $45 million, to be divided equally. They exchanged a quick, smug glance. I could almost hear the champagne corks popping in their heads. Then he turned to me. To my son, Michael, he said, I leave my briefcase. It's in my study. That was it. No explanation. No sentimental note. Just a dusty brown leather briefcase I hadn't seen in years. My sisters tried not to laugh, but they failed. Claire muttered something about Daddy's favorite under her breath, and Victoria giggled behind her tissue. I didn't say a word. I just nodded, stood up, and left the room with the kind of calm that comes from knowing something no one else does. The briefcase was sitting exactly where I remembered it, in the corner of his old study, beside the fireplace. It looked heavy, older than I was, the leather cracked from decades of use. When I opened it, the scent of tobacco and old paper drifted out, bringing with it a wave of memories I'd tried to bury. Inside, there were a few old files, a faded photograph of my mother, and one small folded piece of paper. On it, written in my father's handwriting, was a single phone number and 3 words, "You'll understand soon." I almost laughed. It was so like him, cryptic, controlling, and always testing me. For a moment, I thought about tossing the whole thing into the fire. But curiosity, that old familiar poison, got the better of me. I dialed the number. It rang once. Twice. Then a voice answered. Calm. Professional. Mr. Walker, the voice said, we've been expecting your call. I froze. How do you know my name? I asked. Your father informed us you'd reach out when the time was right, the voice continued. Do you have the case? Yes. Good, they said. Then it's time you know what your inheritance really is. The line went dead. I stood there for a long moment, the silence thick around me. The kind of silence that hums with danger. By nightfall, I found myself driving toward the address the number traced back to, an old property on the outskirts of town my father had once forbidden us from visiting. A forgotten estate, surrounded by dense woods and rusted gates. The kind of place where secrets live. When I arrived, the gate was already open. Lights glowed faintly in the windows, flickering like candles through the fog. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. The air smelled of old wood and dust, and every creak of the floorboards echoed like a warning. And there, sitting on an oak desk in the center of the room, was a single envelope with my name on it. Inside, a letter. If you're reading this, Michael, it means you were the only one who ever listened. The words hit me like a punch. Your sisters wanted wealth. You wanted truth. What's in this house is yours now. It is not money. It is power. And with it, you'll understand why I built everything I did, and why they never could. Beneath the letter was a set of documents, deeds, and a black keycard labeled Project Halcyon. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid, but because I finally understood, the briefcase wasn't a punishment. It was a test. My father's final lesson wasn't about greed or inheritance, it was about legacy. The next morning, the world shifted. Bank accounts moved. Names changed. Shell companies emerged under my father's old empire, all tied to me. My sister's millions were tied to unstable assets, destined to crumble within months. But mine? Mine was built on the foundation beneath it all. They laughed when I got the briefcase. They stopped laughing when I got the empire. And as the last piece of my father's puzzle fell into place, I could almost hear his voice in the back of my mind, steady, deliberate, proud. Now you understand, son. For the next few weeks, I didn't speak to anyone. Not my sisters, not my father's old lawyer, not even the vultures from the press who hovered around the estate like flies circling a carcass. I spent every waking moment inside that creaking old mansion, deciphering what my father had left behind. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became, my father hadn't been a simple businessman. He had built an empire rooted in silence, control, and foresight. The deeds, bank records, and encrypted files hidden within the walls of that house revealed something staggering. He had quietly divested much of his fortune years before his death, hiding it in foundations, shell corporations, and trusts that all traced back to one name, mine. Not Claire. Not Victoria. Just me. My sister's inheritance, on the other hand, was nothing more than a mirage. $45 million of stocks and holdings that looked impressive on paper but were built on crumbling companies and overvalued properties. A ticking bomb wrapped in gold ribbon. He hadn't favored me out of love. No, this was his revenge. Against them, against greed, against everything he believed had poisoned his family. And he'd chosen me to be his weapon. The letter in the briefcase had a postscript, one I hadn't noticed before, scribbled in my father's impatient handwriting at the very bottom: "When the house burns, let it. Then rebuild it in your name." At first, I didn't understand. But 2 months later, when the news broke that my sister's holdings had collapsed, that their accounts were frozen and their fortunes vanished overnight, I knew exactly what he meant. Claire called first. Her voice trembled, the same way it did when she used to lie. "Michael," she said, "something's wrong with the trust. Dad's lawyer isn't returning my calls. The money's gone." I finished for her. "That's unfortunate." There was silence on the other end. A sharp, breathless kind of silence. "You knew," she said finally, her voice shaking with fury. "You knew this would happen." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Victoria called next, her arrogance stripped bare. "Please," she said quietly. "I have 2 mortgages, a husband who's about to walk out, and..." I stopped her there. "Dad gave you what you wanted," I said. "He gave me what I needed." And then, before she could say another word, I hung up. It wasn't about revenge anymore, not in the way they would think. This was correction. My father had spent a lifetime trying to teach us what mattered, and they'd mocked him for it. They measured love in zeros, respect in luxury. And I'd spent years resenting him for treating me differently, for being harder on me than on them. But now, I understood. He wasn't being cruel. He was preparing me. In the months that followed, I used the assets hidden under Project Halcyon to rebuild the family's empire, this time under my name. I donated to charities my father once supported, bought back the businesses my sisters had sold off in ignorance, and restructured them with integrity. The Walker name, once synonymous with scandal and greed, began to mean something again. Every paper, every signature, every decision was a quiet nod to him. To the man who saw farther than any of us could. When the mansion was finally restored, I placed the briefcase, polished, repaired, eternal, on his old desk. Inside, I left my own note. Just 3 words. "I understand now." And as I turned off the light and walked away, I realized something. My father didn't just leave me his legacy. He left me his revenge. A revenge not of anger, but of patience. Not destruction, but justice. My sisters took his money. I took his mind. And in the end, that was worth more than all their millions combined. Years passed, and the story of the Walker family became something of a quiet legend in our town, whispered about in country clubs, over expensive dinners, and in the corridors of power my father once roamed. People speculated endlessly. Some said I manipulated my sisters, that I engineered their downfall out of bitterness. Others claimed my father had predicted every move, orchestrating a moral lesson even from the grave. The truth was far simpler, and far darker. My father knew his daughters better than they knew themselves. He knew greed was a hunger that could never be satisfied, a fire that would consume everything it touched. By giving them the illusion of wealth, he'd given them a mirror. They destroyed themselves trying to grasp their own reflections. Meanwhile, I had learned restraint, the art of quiet revenge. I didn't gloat. I didn't flaunt. I built. Slowly, carefully, methodically. Every contract I signed, every investment I made, every person I hired carried a fragment of his philosophy: precision, control, and justice wrapped in calm. Claire tried to rebuild. She married a man even richer than her ex, but her arrogance and desperation drove him away within 2 years. Victoria moved abroad, chasing another illusion: high-risk ventures, fake investors, shiny dreams that dissolved into debt. By the time they realized they had no real allies left, they turned to me. It was Christmas Eve, the same holiday where they'd once laughed at me for giving Dad a framed photo of the three of us instead of some flashy gift. I sat by the fire when the call came in. This time, both their voices trembled. "Michael," Claire said softly. We need help." "Do you?" I asked, my voice steady. "Or do you just need money?" Victoria broke in, her tone brittle. "You don't understand, we've lost everything. Dad would have wanted us to stay together." I smiled faintly at the flames. "Dad wanted us to learn," I said. "Some of us just took longer to understand the lesson." They didn't argue after that. Maybe they couldn't. Maybe they finally saw what I had, that love and respect don't live in vaults or accounts. They're earned, not inherited. A month later, I arranged for their debts to be quietly settled, not under my name, but through one of my father's dormant trusts. I didn't do it for forgiveness. I did it for closure. Because revenge, when it's done right, isn't about breaking someone. It's about balance. Years later, when I visited my father's grave, I brought the old briefcase with me, the same one that started it all. I knelt beside the headstone, the wind whispering through the trees, and placed it against the stone. "You were right," I murmured. "You knew this family would tear itself apart. But you also knew who'd have to rebuild it." The leather creaked softly as I closed it for the last time. The sun slipped behind the clouds, casting a long shadow across the ground, mine, his, and something larger that bound us together. As I stood to leave, I glanced once more at his name engraved in marble. Thomas Walker, visionary. Father. Teacher. He didn't leave me money. He left me clarity. And through that clarity, I carried out the most elegant revenge imaginable, one that didn't destroy, but defined. Because in the end, power isn't about what you own. It's about what you understand. And I finally understood everything my father wanted me to. The years that followed were quieter, but not empty. There was a strange peace in knowing the storm had finally passed, that every ounce of chaos had settled into something almost poetic. My father's company, the one my sisters had once called old-fashioned, was thriving again under my care. We shifted focus to innovation, to legacy, to people, the things that truly last. Every morning, I'd walk through the marble lobby of Walker Industries, and I'd see his portrait hanging above the main staircase. His gaze still carried that same quiet challenge it always had, a mix of pride and expectation. For the first time in my life, I could meet it without flinching. Sometimes, I caught myself remembering the way things used to be, the laughter echoing through our family dinners, the fights over nothing, the hollow apologies. My sisters and I never fully reconciled, but something unspoken changed between us. When I visited Claire one winter, she looked older than I remembered, not in years, but in weight. The kind that regret leaves behind. She poured me tea, her hands trembling slightly. "You could have destroyed us," she said finally. "You didn't." I looked at her, really looked. There was no more arrogance in her eyes, no more pretense. Just exhaustion. Humanity. I didn't have to, I said quietly. You did that yourselves. I just didn't stop it. For a long time, we sat in silence. The kind that doesn't need to be broken. A few months later, I heard from Victoria too. She'd started teaching art classes at a small community center overseas. It wasn't wealth, but it was honest work. In her letter, she wrote, "Dad would have been proud of you. You did what he couldn't." I smiled when I read that, not out of triumph, but out of something deeper. Maybe relief. Maybe peace. Because she was right. I hadn't avenged him in the way most people imagine revenge to be. I hadn't shouted, or burned bridges, or taken blood for blood. I'd simply rebuilt what they broke. And in doing that, I'd done something none of them ever expected. I'd restored our name. One night, years later, I found myself back in my father's study. The briefcase sat on the desk, worn but preserved, the leather soft from time. I ran my fingers over the initials etched into the brass clasp, TW. There was still one paper inside, yellowed and fragile. The original letter. I'd read it hundreds of times, but that night, the words hit differently. Money is borrowed. Power is temporary. But understanding, Michael, that is eternal. I whispered the words aloud, then folded the letter carefully and placed it back. Outside, rain began to fall against the window, steady, rhythmic, cleansing. The kind of rain that washes away everything that doesn't belong. As I looked out into the night, I realized something my father had probably known all along: revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers. Sometimes, it's not about punishment at all, it's about restoration. He gave my sisters the illusion of everything, so they could learn what nothing felt like. He gave me nothing, so I could build everything. That was his lesson. That was his justice. And that was his final act of love. As I turned off the light and stepped into the quiet hallway, I caught my reflection in the glass. Older now, yes, but not bitter. Just settled. The fire that had once fueled me had turned into something else. Resolve. Understanding. My father may have died years ago, but that night, I finally felt like I'd truly met him. Not as a son, but as the man he'd always hoped I'd become. The years stretched on, but time, as I learned, doesn't dull the sharpest memories, it only refines them. There were still nights when I'd wake to echoes of my father's voice, or flashes of those tense dinners when every word was a transaction and every silence a weapon. But the bitterness had faded. In its place, there was something softer. Understanding. Maybe even forgiveness. The company flourished in ways he could have only dreamed of. Walker Industries became known not for its wealth, but for its principles, something my father would have considered the ultimate victory. Our focus shifted to sustainable ventures, education programs, and scholarships for underprivileged families. I made sure his name was on every single one. Not as a brand, but as a reminder. One afternoon, while I was reviewing proposals in my office, I received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was hesitant, fragile. "Michael," it said softly, "it's Claire." She didn't need to say more. I could hear it, the weariness, the years of struggle, the humility that only comes after life has stripped you bare. She told me Victoria had fallen ill, something terminal. She wanted to see me before it was too late. I flew out the next morning. The hospice was quiet, the air heavy with antiseptic and memories. Victoria lay pale and frail in the bed, but when she saw me, she smiled. A real smile, small, but sincere. "You came," she whispered. "Of course," I said, pulling a chair closer. "You're still my sister." She laughed weakly. "Funny. You say that now, after everything. We talked for hours, about childhood, about Dad, about the mess we all made trying to prove something that didn't matter. She admitted she'd spent years hating me, then more years hating herself. And now, in the end, she just wanted peace. "I get it now," she said finally, looking out the window. "He wasn't cruel. He was preparing us." But I think I was too proud to see it. When she passed that night, she looked calm. Like she'd finally set something down she'd been carrying too long. Claire and I stood outside afterward, the night cold and endless. For the first time in decades, she reached for my hand. "He was right about you," she said. "You were the only one who could rebuild what we destroyed." For a moment, I didn't answer. I just looked at her, the sister who once mocked me for being Dad's charity case. There was no resentment left. Just the strange, quiet ache that comes from surviving what others couldn't. After the funeral, I visited my father's grave again, 3 names carved beside his now, my mother's, Victoria's, and the space where Claire and I would one day rest. The briefcase wasn't there anymore. I'd locked it away years ago, its purpose fulfilled. But I could still hear his words, like they were carried in the wind that moved through the trees. "When the house burns, let it. Then rebuild it in your name." The house had burned. And I had rebuilt it, not from ash and ruin, but from understanding and restraint. I'd become the kind of man my father believed in, not one who takes vengeance with fire, but one who restores with purpose. As I stood there, a strange calm filled me. The kind that feels final, not in loss, but in completion. My family's story, fractured and cruel and painfully human, had found its ending. Not a happy one, perhaps, but an honest one. I turned to leave, the last light of dusk falling behind me. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was walking away from something. I felt like I was walking toward peace. Years later, peace became a habit. It wasn't loud or dramatic, it was found in the small, ordinary moments. The sound of coffee brewing in the morning, the creak of the office door as I walked into the place that once felt like my father's kingdom but now felt like my own. People began to forget the scandals, the headlines, the inheritance war that once defined the Walker name. New faces filled the boardrooms, people who never knew the family that built the empire. They only knew the company's integrity, its quiet, relentless pursuit of purpose over profit. That was my father's true revenge, his final lesson, realized through me. Sometimes, I would find myself standing in front of his portrait, just as I had in those first difficult years. His eyes seemed to follow me, stern but proud. There was still so much I wished I could say to him. I wanted to tell him that I understood now why he chose me, not because I was better, but because I was willing to learn. Because I had to fall before I could rise. But mostly, I wanted to tell him that I forgave him. For the burden. For the silence. For the briefcase that started it all. Because in the end, that single object, a dusty, old briefcase, had carried not money or power, but something infinitely more valuable, intention. As I grew older, I noticed that people came to me for advice more often than business. They'd sit across my desk, telling me about betrayals, losses, ambitions, and I'd listen. Really listen. Sometimes, I'd give them the same words my father once left for me: money is borrowed. Power is temporary. But understanding, that is eternal. It wasn't until I turned 60 that I finally decided to let go of the past completely. I sold the old family mansion, not because I needed to, but because it no longer felt like home. The memories there had finished their story. I bought a smaller house by the sea instead, a quiet place where I could hear the waves and think without the ghosts of my family echoing through the halls. On the last day before leaving, I took one final walk through the study. The air smelled of aged wood and memory. I ran my hand along the shelves, paused by the window, and looked at the empty space on the desk where the briefcase had once been. For a moment, I could almost see him, my father, standing there, that same slight smirk on his face, the one that said, "You finally figured it out, didn't you?" I did, I whispered. And it only took me a lifetime. When I closed the door for the last time, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like release. Like the final act of a story that had carried too much weight for too long. In the years that followed, I rarely spoke about the inheritance or the chaos that came after. People assumed I'd simply been the lucky son who managed things better. Let them think that. The truth didn't need to be told anymore, it had already done its work. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat on my porch overlooking the ocean. The wind was calm, the waves whispering against the shore. I closed my eyes and thought about the generations before me, the ones who'd built, broken, and rebuilt again. Revenge, I realized, isn't always about payback. Sometimes, it's about understanding why something had to happen the way it did, and ensuring that cycle doesn't repeat. My father gave my sisters gold, but it melted away. He gave me dust, but it turned to stone. And as the stars emerged, one by one, I smiled softly. Not because I'd won, but because I'd finally learned what he wanted me to. Some inherit money. Some inherit power. I inherited purpose. And in the end, that was the richest inheritance of all. The ocean became my companion in those final years. Every morning, I'd walk down to the water's edge, the sand cool beneath my feet, the air thick with salt and memory. There was a rhythm to it, a kind of meditation that reminded me of balance, of patience, of everything my father had tried to teach me in his quiet, unforgiving way. I'd watch the tide come in, swallow the footprints I'd left, and then retreat, clean and unburdened. It was poetic, really, how the sea erased the marks of the past but never stopped returning. Just like me. I had built and rebuilt my life so many times that I stopped counting. Each version of myself carried a little less anger, a little more understanding. Claire came to visit sometimes. The years had softened her too. We didn't talk about the inheritance anymore, there was no need. Instead, we'd sit on the porch, sipping tea, sharing old stories that once hurt too much to tell. She'd laugh, that same sharp laugh she had when we were kids, and for brief moments, I saw the sister I'd grown up with, the one before the money, before the fractures. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in bruised golds and fading reds, she turned to me and said, "You know, I used to think you were the unlucky one. The one who got left out. But now I think you were the only one who ever really got something." I smiled. Maybe. But it didn't feel that way for a long time. She nodded. Dad always said time reveals the truth. I just didn't realize how long it would take. When she left that night, I stood by the water long after dark, the sound of the waves washing over me like a lullaby. I thought about my father again, about the weight of his choices. For years, I'd seen his actions as cruel, manipulative. But now, I saw the precision. He hadn't punished us, he'd crafted a test. And somehow, I'd been the only one to solve it. I often wondered if he'd predicted it all, how greed would hollow my sisters out, how guilt would bring them back, how time would forge me into the man he couldn't be. Maybe he hadn't planned it to perfection, but he'd known enough about human nature to trust the outcome. On my 70th birthday, I received a letter. No name, no return address, just my own on the envelope, written in the same deliberate handwriting my father had used decades ago. My heart skipped as I opened it, though I knew it couldn't really be from him. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one sentence typed neatly in the center: "You finally rebuilt the house, son." No signature. No explanation. I laughed. A deep, full laugh that startled the gulls outside. I didn't care who sent it. Maybe Claire, maybe someone from the company who knew the story. Maybe it didn't matter. Because the truth was, he was right. I had rebuilt the house, not the mansion, not the business, but our name, our integrity, and, most of all, myself. That night, I sat by the fire with the letter in my hand. I thought about that dusty briefcase, about the phone call, about how one small, seemingly meaningless gift had unraveled a lifetime of greed and revealed something pure underneath. In the end, my father didn't leave me money. He left me a choice. To destroy, or to rebuild. To repeat, or to rise. And in choosing the latter, I learned the one truth that outlasted everything else: revenge isn't about retribution. It's about restoration. The next morning, as dawn broke over the horizon, I walked to the water one last time. I placed the letter inside a small glass bottle and let the waves carry it away. It drifted, then vanished into the vastness of the sea, like every hurt, every scar, every ghost that had once haunted the Walker name. I turned back toward the house as sunlight spilled across the shore. The world was quiet again. Whole again. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the son left behind. I felt like the man my father always knew I could become. Years passed, and the rhythm of the sea became the rhythm of my days. The tides, steady and patient, taught me what no inheritance, no empire, no fortune ever could: how to exist without needing to win. I spent my mornings walking the shore and my evenings watching the horizon dissolve into gold and gray. Life had become simple, but not empty. The weight of everything, the betrayals, the greed, the loneliness, had settled somewhere deep in me, not as pain anymore, but as a kind of wisdom. People often say revenge leaves you hollow, that it consumes you. But I found the opposite was true: if you waited long enough. It didn't leave me empty. It left me clear. Claire passed quietly a few winters later. Her last letter came folded inside a Christmas card, the kind we used to exchange when we were still pretending to be a family. In it, she wrote, "You did what none of us could, you made peace with him, and with yourself. Tell him that, if you still talk to him." I read that line over and over. If you still talk to him. And I realized, I did. Every day, in some way. He lived in every decision I made, every act of restraint, every moment I chose silence over fury. My father wasn't gone. He'd simply become part of the stillness around me. After her funeral, I drove back to the coast. The world had grown quieter by then, technology had replaced conversation, and the young didn't remember the man who'd once ruled an empire. I preferred it that way. Legacy, I had learned, doesn't need an audience. That night, a storm rolled in, fierce, cold, and alive. Thunder rumbled across the horizon, and lightning illuminated the dark stretch of sea. I stood on the porch, watching it all unfold, and for a moment, I felt him there again. My father. The same unyielding energy, the same precision in the chaos. "Still testing me, aren't you?" I whispered. But this time, there was no resentment in my voice. Only a tired, fond sort of amusement. The kind you save for someone you've finally forgiven. When morning came, the storm was gone, and the air was clear. The world smelled of salt and renewal. The waves had washed up something strange near the edge of the shore, a bottle. Old, green glass, chipped and barnacled, with something folded inside. My heart slowed as I picked it up. Inside was my own handwriting, the letter I'd sent to the sea years ago. The paper was faded, but the words were still there: "You finally rebuilt the house, son." I laughed quietly to myself, the sound carried away by the wind. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe the sea, like my father, had a way of bringing things back when they were truly finished. That afternoon, I sat by the water, the letter beside me, the horizon stretched endlessly ahead. I thought about everything that had come and gone: my sisters, the mansion, the empire, the storms and silences between them all. It felt complete. And as the sun dipped low, turning the waves into sheets of fire, I realized that the story wasn't one of revenge anymore. It had never been, not really. It was about inheritance, not of wealth, but of understanding. Not of property, but of purpose. I had spent a lifetime chasing what my father left behind, only to find that what he truly gave me couldn't be spent, sold, or stolen. He gave me the strength to lose everything and still rise. He gave me the clarity to see what others couldn't. He gave me the silence, the one that doesn't punish, but teaches. As the last light of day faded, I folded the letter one final time and tucked it into my coat pocket. The tide came in, brushing against my shoes. And for the first time in years, I whispered out loud, "Thank you, Dad." The wind carried the words out to sea, and I watched until they vanished into the horizon, knowing that, somewhere out there, he heard me. The water shimmered with the last glow of sunset, and I turned back toward the house. The light from the porch cast a warm glow against the darkening sky. It wasn't a mansion, or a monument, or a legacy carved in stone. But it was home. And after all those years, after the greed, the betrayal, the rebuilding, I finally understood, that was what he wanted for me all along. As the days went by, the quiet began to feel like an old friend. I started to measure time differently, not in meetings, or contracts, or headlines, but in the ebb and flow of the tide, the way the light hit the water at dusk, the creak of the wooden floorboards under my feet. For so long, I'd lived with the noise of ambition and vengeance in my head. Now, all I heard was the ocean, steady, forgiving, endless. Sometimes I'd sit outside with a glass of whiskey and watch the horizon fade into shadow. The sea always looked different at night, darker, deeper, full of secrets that didn't need to be solved. I liked that. It reminded me of my father. He had been a man of secrets, too, the kind who spoke in riddles and taught lessons in silence. I used to resent that. I used to think he enjoyed being cryptic, like he wanted me to fail before I could understand him. But now I knew the truth, he wasn't trying to confuse me. He was trying to prepare me. I'd built an empire once, like him. I'd watched it grow, not with greed, but with intent. I'd used his methods, patience, precision, restraint. And when I finally stepped away, I left it stronger than ever, guided by people who understood that integrity wasn't a slogan, it was currency. My name didn't need to be carved into the walls for my presence to linger. That was another thing he'd taught me, real influence doesn't announce itself. It just endures. On my 75th birthday, I received an invitation from the new CEO of Walker Industries, a woman in her 30s named Lena, sharp-minded and fiercely independent. She wanted me to attend the unveiling of a new philanthropic wing named after my father. I almost declined. I didn't like public appearances anymore, too many eyes, too much noise. But something about it felt right, like a full circle closing quietly on its own. The ceremony was small, tasteful. The building itself was glass and stone, strong and simple. As I walked through the halls, I saw photos of my father, of his early years building the foundation, and then, surprisingly, a photo of me, taken decades ago. The caption beneath it read, "The man who restored the vision." For a moment, my breath caught. It wasn't pride that I felt. It was peace. The kind that seeps into your bones, quiet and permanent. After the speeches ended and the crowd thinned, I stayed behind. The lights dimmed, and the hall fell into silence. I stood before my father's portrait, the same one that had hung in his old office, now restored and glowing softly beneath the lights. "Looks like we did it," I said softly. "Your name still means something." And for the first time, I swear I could almost hear him answer. Not with words, but with that familiar stillness, the same presence I'd felt by the ocean, in the rain, in the long stretches of quiet when the world went still. When I stepped outside, the city lights flickered in the distance, and the air smelled faintly of rain. I drove home along the coast, the road winding beside the dark waves. My hands felt steady on the wheel, my heart unburdened. That night, I sat by the window of my seaside house, looking out at the black expanse of water. The stars were dim, scattered, but enough to paint the sky with life. I thought about my sisters, both gone now. I thought about how differently things could have gone if greed hadn't taken hold. But then again, maybe this was the only way it could have gone. Maybe we each got the lesson we deserved. I smiled faintly. The house burned, I murmured, repeating his words from long ago. And I rebuilt it in my name. Outside, the wind rose and fell, carrying the faint scent of the tide. Somewhere in that sound, in that endless rhythm of return and retreat, I could still hear him. Not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as something eternal. The sea had taken everything once, my innocence, my family, my illusions. But in the end, it gave me something far greater. Clarity. And that, I realized, was the true inheritance my father left me. Not the money. Not the empire. But the wisdom to know when to fight, and when to let the tide take what it must. I finished my drink, turned off the light, and let the night wrap around me. The sound of the waves filled the silence, and for the first time in my long, complicated life, I felt it completely, the weight of peace. And I knew, wherever he was, he felt it too. The morning came soft and gray, the kind that seeps gently through the curtains and asks nothing of you. I woke early, out of habit, the same way my father used to, before the sun, before the noise. Old men like us never really sleep deeply. We drift between memories. I made a cup of black coffee and stepped onto the porch. The air was cold enough to sting, but clean, the kind that wakes your mind faster than caffeine. The sea stretched endlessly before me, calm today, almost still. It reminded me of that first day, years ago, when I'd opened the dusty briefcase and found the note inside. That single phone number. That single thread that had pulled me into everything that came after: betrayal, discovery, truth, and eventually, freedom. It's strange how something so small can turn the entire course of a life. My sisters never understood that. They thought fortune came from gold and signatures, from being seen, from being admired. But I learned something different. Real wealth lives quietly, in knowing who you are when no one's watching. A seagull landed near the railing, eyeing me with that unbothered confidence only creatures of the coast seem to have. I chuckled softly, tossing a crumb from the bread I'd been holding. "You remind me of him," I said without thinking. "Always watching. Always waiting for the right moment." The bird tilted its head, and for a moment, it felt like he was there, my father, in all his quiet wisdom, reminding me that patience always wins in the end. I thought about my sisters again. After everything, I had helped them in ways they'd never know. I didn't need their gratitude, that would have cheapened it. I'd ensured their children had opportunities, even if their parents had failed to see the bigger picture. I'd learned that revenge, when tempered by understanding, can become something greater, not destruction, but restoration. Some people spend their lives chasing fairness, but fairness isn't real. Balance is. Life takes and gives, in its own time, in its own way. My father understood that better than anyone. That's why he left me the briefcase, because he knew I wouldn't chase the money. He trusted me to build something that couldn't be stolen or spent away. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of salt and pine. Somewhere in the distance, a ship's horn echoed, deep and low. I smiled. I'd always loved that sound, the reminder that even when you think the world has forgotten you, someone, somewhere, is still moving forward. I went back inside, the old floor creaking beneath my steps. On the mantel sat the same briefcase, restored and polished now, its leather soft from years of handling. I kept it there not as a trophy, but as a reminder, that sometimes, the smallest inheritance holds the greatest power. Inside it now was a new letter, written in my hand. It wasn't addressed to anyone yet. But I knew someday, someone would need it, maybe a grandchild lost in their own storm, or a son searching for meaning after everything else failed. I didn't write instructions. Just one sentence. When you've lost everything you thought mattered, open this. Then beneath it, a phone number. Not the one my father left me, but one I'd leave behind, to continue the circle. The light from the window fell across the briefcase, golden and soft, and for a moment, the whole house seemed to glow. I stood there, coffee cooling in my hand, and felt something rare, legacy, not of wealth, but of wisdom. The kind of inheritance you can't touch, but you can feel in your bones. And I realized, maybe that's what my father meant all along. Money fades. Empires fall. But truth outlasts everything. As the years rolled forward, the world outside changed faster than I could keep up with. New buildings rose, old ones vanished, and the city that once held my family's empire became a stranger to me. But out here, by the sea, time still moved like it always had, slow, deliberate, and honest. I never remarried. I never felt the need to. My peace wasn't in companionship anymore, it was in purpose. The few people who visited me over the years, business partners, old friends, sometimes a curious journalist who wanted to dig up the mystery behind the Walker fortune, all left the same way, puzzled. They expected arrogance, wealth flaunted, a man who basked in the glory of his triumph. Instead, they found an old man with calloused hands who still brewed his coffee on a stovetop and spent his evenings mending fishing nets he didn't even use. They didn't understand that after a lifetime of fighting for what's right, or what you think is right, the greatest luxury is stillness. One winter evening, the storm hit. Not a gentle drizzle or the rhythmic pounding of rain I'd grown to love, but a real storm, fierce and relentless, howling through the cracks of the house like an old spirit come to test my resolve. Power went out just after dusk, and the world outside disappeared into blackness. I sat by the fireplace, watching the flames fight against the dark, and thought about him again. My father. He'd faced storms too, different kinds, the kind that came in the form of boardroom betrayals, whispers in corridors, the slow poison of envy from those closest to him. And somehow, he'd survived it all with quiet dignity. I used to wonder how he did it. That night, as thunder cracked overhead and the sea roared like a wounded beast, I finally understood. He never fought the storm. He listened to it. When the wind finally died and silence settled back over the coast, I stepped outside. The air smelled sharp, metallic, like renewal. The briefcase sat on the porch table where I'd left it, a thin layer of salt clinging to its corners. I brushed it clean and smiled. It had survived, just like everything else that mattered. A few days later, I received a letter. It was from my niece, Clara, one of my sister's daughters. We hadn't spoken in over a decade. She'd written that she'd stumbled across an old article about me and wanted to know the truth, not the one printed in magazines, but the real story. I thought about ignoring it. The past had a way of pulling you back into wars you'd already won. But something in her words struck me, sincerity, curiosity, and maybe a hint of the same loneliness I once carried. So I invited her to visit. She arrived one morning, her car crunching up the gravel driveway, eyes wide with that familiar blend of awe and uncertainty. She looked like her mother but carried herself differently, less arrogance, more awareness. I saw something in her that reminded me of myself when I first opened that briefcase all those years ago, confusion laced with purpose. We sat on the porch, the ocean calm again, and she asked me everything. About the will. The briefcase. The revenge. The forgiveness. I told her everything, not to glorify it, but to teach her what my father had taught me, that the true measure of a person isn't in what they inherit, but in what they do when they have nothing. When I finished, she sat in silence for a long while, staring at the sea. Then she said softly, "He must have known you were the only one who could handle it." I nodded. He did. And now I think he'd want me to pass that faith on. I went inside, opened the briefcase one last time, and handed her the note I'd written years before, the one that simply read, "When you've lost everything you thought mattered, open this." She looked at it, puzzled, then smiled. "You really are a walker," she said. When she drove away that afternoon, I felt something shift in the air, a release, like the closing of a long, unfinished chapter. I'd carried my father's lesson for decades, and now, finally, it belonged to someone else. That night, I sat by the fire again. The house was quiet except for the soft crackle of burning wood. I looked around, at the framed photograph of my father on the mantel, the ocean through the window, the faint reflection of my own tired face in the glass. And for the first time, I didn't see a man defined by revenge or justice or legacy. I saw a man who had finally found his place in the silence. As the flames dimmed, I whispered to the shadows, "You were right, Dad. It was never about the money." The wind sighed through the open window, gentle and knowing. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the sound of the sea carry me home.